For the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant completely rewrote the preface, or rather he just wrote a new preface. And so we have the B preface as a separate thing to read, and it is much more substantial than the A preface. So what's going on in the B preface? Well, some of the same notes that were struck in the first edition's preface are going to be here too, but Kant starts out with a rather new approach actually. Kant starts out by giving us a sort of getting us into the idea of his philosophy through a sequence of other sciences. He talks about logic and why it is successful. He talks about mathematics and what needed to happen in order to make it successful. He talks about physical science and points out what needed to happen in order to make that successful. And then he sort of tells us that there is a commonality to those three sciences, or to those three sciences once they became successful. And he proposes as a kind of hypothesis that maybe the same kind of thing needs to happen if we want to make metaphysics successful. So here in the second edition preface, Kant really sort of proposes his own philosophy as an experiment or a hypothesis, the results of which will show whether his fundamental idea is a good idea or not. Now, I think we cannot stress enough that although Kant apparently thinks that this is a nice way to sort of introduce things, a nice way to get people to become interested in the way that he's doing things, maybe to make them think it's more natural than they might otherwise think it. At the same time, Kant never really puts forward his own philosophy in the manner of a hypothesis or an experiment. Right? What he's going to do in the main text is he's going to try to prove from step one that what he's doing is the right way of doing things. He's not going to say, well, this is a hypothesis, let's check out what happens if we were to assume it's truth. So although, you know, some passages in the preface might suggest that, that's not really true. And in fact, Kant gives us a footnote, and this is the footnote to BXXII, where he says, and this is the last lines, even though in the treatise itself it will be proved not hypothetically, but rather apodictically. Apodictically means with perfect certainty. Right? It will be proved not hypothetically, but rather apodictically from the constitution of our representations of space and time, and from the elementary concepts of the understanding. So Kant has a footnote there which basically says, yeah, you know, the first couple of pages of my preface, I hope they're kind of nice and they kind of get you into my idea, but don't take them too seriously. Okay, so let's look at this sequence of science. So the first thing that Kant talks about is logic. And about logic, he tells us that the understanding has to do with nothing further than itself and its own form. And that is why it can be certain and why it can be true, right? So Kant goes as far as to say that Aristotle basically brought forth logic whole and complete. Nothing was wrong in it, but also nothing could be added to it. That's because this is just about like the general rules of thought that are in our understanding itself. So all we have to do is like kind of check it and we know it. So I think it's probably fair to point out that Kant's claim that logic didn't change between his own time and Aristotle's time is probably overblown. But there is a certain continuity there. It is after Kant's time, and especially around the beginning of the 20th century, that what we call modern logic comes up, and there are lots and lots of big advances and changes. Okay, so this is the way that Kant thinks about logic. It's important, but it's not very big and, in a sense, not very interesting. It's just like empty rules of thought. That is sort of what it gives us. It's not really a science, Kant goes as far as to say. And so, of course, for the sciences, things will be more difficult. Okay, so when we look at the sciences, then the first thing that comes to mind as a science that is successful is mathematics. And so Kant points out that mathematics didn't immediately get off to a good start. This had to be, you know, sort of we had to invent the right method of mathematics, or the right way of doing mathematics. And the right way of doing mathematics turns out to be, well, it turns out to be a sort of emancipation from what is given to us by the objects, right? If I think that mathematics is about triangles, like the kinds of things I can draw and then measure, then it seems like a sort of empirical science, and it's never going to give me the kind of certain results that mathematics actually gives us. So what had to happen? What had to happen is that we had to understand that in mathematics, we're only thinking about what we posit or construct ourselves, right? We come up with the idea of a triangle. We construct a triangle, sort of maybe abstractly in our minds, in what Kant is later going to explain is our intuition. And because we've constructed it ourselves, right, that's why we can fully grasp it, and that's why we can get truths about it. So we had to re-understand mathematics as something that we generate ourselves before it could really get onto the road of a secure science. Now, when it comes to physics and the empirical sciences, things are of course a bit different. I mean, we don't posit physical objects in the sense that we posit or construct a mathematical triangle, right? The objects of physics they're out there, they're here in the world around us. But still, Kant is going to claim there is something that we are putting into the world when we do physics, and this was in fact a great discovery, and precisely the discovery that allowed us to put physics too on the path of a secure science. And this is the way that Kant describes it. He says that a light dawned on all those who study nature. They comprehended that reason has insight only into what it itself produces according to its own design, that it must take the lead with principles for its judgments according to constant laws and compel nature to answer its questions, rather than letting nature guide its movements by keeping reason, as it were, in leading strings. For otherwise accidental observations, made according to no previously designed plan, can never connect up into a necessary law, which is yet what reason seeks and requires. And so one thing that Kant is thinking about here is the advent of the experimental method, right? So in earlier science, in antique science, basically people thought that science was based on observation, right? You go out in nature, you see what happens, but not so much on what we would call an experiment, in which you try to control all the circumstances in order to force nature to reveal some particular pattern that you have theoretical reasons to be interested in. And so what Kant is pointing out is that this modern natural science has an active method in which we take the rein, in which our understanding takes the rein, and as we will later see, in which certain principles that come from our understanding are going to take the rein. And only when we do that, and when we approach nature in such an active spirit, are we going to be able to do natural science the way that it ought to be done. So what do we see here in logic, mathematics, and physics? Well, in three different ways, really, we see that we put something into the object of knowledge, right? We are being active. We are looking at our understanding, we are looking at our constructions, or we are performing our experiments, and that is necessary for us to have knowledge, for us to have this secure path. In metaphysics, we don't have a very good science of metaphysics, right? It's just people disagreeing with each other. This is something we heard in the A preface too. And this brings Kant to some agonized questions, right? Is it perhaps impossible, metaphysics? Why then has nature afflicted our reason with the restless striving for such a path, as if it were one of reason's most important occupations? So what we see here, I think, is Kant takes this really seriously. If reason has a natural striving, that is something to take seriously. Kant has, importantly, I would say, a very teleological, a very goal-directed conception of reason. And that is something that maybe we'll come back to, and I think it's something that plays an important role in the third critique too. But of course that is beyond our current preoccupations. Okay, so this is we now come to the most famous long passage I guess, from the B preface. There's a very famous short passage later on, but here's the most famous long passage. It's the passage where Kant brings in this idea of Copernicus. So here's what Kant writes on BXVI 16, Roman 16. Up to now, it has been assumed that all our cognition must conform to the objects. But all attempts to find out something about them a priori through concepts that would extend our cognition have on this presupposition come to nothing. Hence let us once try whether we do not get farther with the problems of metaphysics by assuming that the objects must conform to our cognition. Right, so Kant is here suggesting a reversal. If we think that our cognition, our attempts to get knowledge, have to conform, have to fit themselves or shape themselves to the objects, well, that's what everybody has been assuming up until now, and it's been a disaster. Let's try the opposite, right? We have seen that in all these other sciences, we put something in the world. Maybe in metaphysics, what we should take seriously is the idea that the objects must conform to our cognition, right? It is we who, in some sense, impress something, maybe. That's the suggestion that we're getting here, on the object. This would be just like the first thoughts of Copernicus, who, when he did not make good progress in the explanation of the celestial motions, if he assumed that the entire celestial host revolves around the observer, tried to see if he might not have a greater success if he made the observer resolve and left the stars at rest. Right. So what Kant is talking about is Copernicus's idea that it's not the entire heavens that go around us every day, but that it's the Earth that turns on its axis every day. Right? So when we see that the stars move, that's because we are moving, not because the stars are moving. There's a surprisingly large literature about whether Kant is right to invoke Copernicus here, what his thoughts have to do with Copernicus's actual thoughts. One prevalent sort of criticism here of Kant is that one of the things that Copernicus does, right? Copernicus is most famous, of course, for claiming that it's the sun that is at the center of the universe and not the earth that is at the center of the universe. And so humanity gets displaced from its central position in the universe to, somewhere else. And then if you look at Kant, he is sort of doing the opposite, right? Putting humanity at the center of the universe. It's we who give the laws to nature. But that's clearly not what Kant is talking about, right? Kant is talking about not the place of the earth or the sun. He's talking about whether it's the heavens that go around the earth or whether it's the earth that goes around. And then it's our movement, our activity that makes us see something in nature. So, I mean, you shouldn't push the metaphor too far, like any metaphor, but it makes some sense, right? That this is the way that Kant expresses himself. And so Kant tells us that in metaphysics we can try in a similar way regarding the intuition of objects. And we'll say much more about intuition later, but like the basic idea is that intuition is how objects are given to us, right? It's through intuition or in an intuition that an object is given or appears to us. And for human beings, intuition comes in the form of sensation, right? Objects are given to us in sensation. If intuition has to conform to the constitution of the objects, then I do not see how we can know anything of them a priori. But if the object, as an object of the senses, conforms to the constitution of our faculty of intuition, then I can very well represent this possibility to myself. Yet, because I cannot stop with these intuitions if they are to become cognitions, but must refer them as representations to something as their object, and determine this object through them, I can assume either that the concepts through which I bring about this determination also conform to the objects, and then I am once again in the same difficulty about how I could know anything about them a priori, or else I assume that the objects, or what is the same thing, the experience in which alone they can be cognized, conforms to those concepts, in which case I immediately see an easier way out of the difficulty, since experience itself is a kind of cognition requiring the understanding, whose rule I have to presuppose in myself before any object is given to me, etc. Wow, this is one of these very long Kantian sentences that are maybe not particularly clear on a first reading. So what Kant is saying is this, right? The first thing that he is saying is that if my intuition has to conform to the object, it's hard to see how I can know anything about the object before it's given to me, right? A priori. So a priori knowledge about the world seems to be impossible. If it's the other way around, that looks better. I will come back to the question whether this really makes sense in a later video, but let's go with Kant here for a moment. But Kant goes on to say, and this is a very important move in the whole Kantian philosophy, I can't stop with intuitions. In order to have cognition, in order to have any kind of knowledge, I must bring concepts to bear on those intuitions, right? A bare intuition, well, what that would even be for Kant is the subject of quite a lot of Kant literature, actually. But if you have an intuition that is in no way conceptualized, where concepts have not been applied to it, it would not be the kind of thing that could be called knowledge, or that could, form knowledge without concepts intervening, right? As soon as I think something, as soon as I claim I know something, I have something conceptual, some statement, some proposition that can be true or false. This requires concepts. We will get back to this distinction between intuitions and concepts at length later on. But for now, it's important to see that this is what Kant thinks. There's intuitions, how things are given, and then there's concepts that we apply to those intuitions. And for those concepts, the same question arises, right? Do they have to conform to the object? In that case, it's hard to see how I could know anything a priori, because knowledge requires concepts, but those concepts have to sort of shape themselves to the objects that I find. If, on the other hand, it's the objects that are shaped by the concepts, that's a different story, right? So Kant has intuitions and concepts, and he says for both of them, we're going to have to assume that the objects are going to be formed according to them, rather than the other way around, right? That the objects conform to these elements of our cognition. That's the word he has been using. Okay, again, let me state that in the footnote that we now come to, Kant says, yeah, I'm bringing this all up as a kind of hypothesis, but that's not really the way it's going to be in the main text, and I think we should keep that in mind. This passage about the Copernican revolution is in many ways very mysterious, maybe also very important. A lot has been written about it, and I will have several videos in which I discuss further what this Copernican revolution amounts to and how we should think about it. Because there are definitely some ways of thinking about this that are just wrong, and other interpretative questions that we would have to answer before we can really make sense of what Kant is trying to do here. So we will come back to this Copernican revolution at length in the videos after this one. So we move on through the preface. We kind of have done the most important things. What Kant is going to do in the B preface that he doesn't really do in the A preface is he is going to talk to us about practical reason, right? About reason that has to do with how we should act in the world. And he is going to argue that his theoretical system, given in the Critique of Pure Reason, is very useful for the aims of practical reason. And of course he writes this because he has been thinking about practical reason a lot, thinking about what's going to be the Critique of Practical Reason, thinking about his ethical works. And so he wants to place more stress on that than he did in the first edition preface. So what Kant is going to claim is that although the Critique of Pure Reason shows that we can't know anything with certainty about God, immortality, and freedom, what the Critique of Practical Reason, what the Critique of Pure Reason does do is it shows us that there is room for thinking that in a sense we are free and we are immortal, and maybe there is a God. So here is something that Kant says about that on BXXVIII, so Roman 28. He tells us that then just the same will is thought of in the appearance in visible actions as necessarily subject to the law of nature and to this extent not free, while yet on the other hand it is thought of as belonging to a thing in itself as not subject to that law, and hence free, without any contradiction hereby occurring. So here Kant has introduced this distinction between the appearance and the thing in itself. We're going to talk about that a lot later on. But the basic idea is that this Copernican revolution tells us that our theoretical cognition is about appearances, not about things in themselves. And it tells us that for instance, the category of causation, so our thinking of things as being paired as cause and effect, and everything falling under a sort of law of causation that shows that everything is determined by prior causes and so on and so forth, that applies to appearances, but it doesn't apply to the thing in itself. Now, Kant says, there's no contradiction in thinking that I, as an appearance, as an empirical being in the empirical world, fall under the laws of nature and am not free. But as a thing in itself, if that's the right way to say it, I might be free. Right? There's no contradiction there. And so my theoretical philosophy allows us to affirm at the same time that the world has the strict laws of causation and that we are free. And he goes on to say, now, although I cannot cognize my soul, considered from the latter side, as a thing in itself, through any speculative reason, still less through empirical observation, and hence I cannot cognize freedom as a property of any being to which I ascribe effects in the world of sense, nevertheless I can think freedom to myself. That is, the representation of it as least contains no contradiction in itself. Here, cognize means basically the same thing as know. I can't know that I'm free, but I can think that I'm free. I can, without contradiction, think myself as free. And that's really all that's needed for morality, according to Kant. And so that is why he ends up saying at BXXX, and this is the most famous sentence from the B preface, he says, thus I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. And the faith here is a faith in immortality, in God, and in our own moral freedom. And Kant thinks that this is all very, very useful. And so people who have thought that the Critique of Pure Reason, by destroying proofs of the existence of God and things like that, is somehow a bad thing, having negative social effects, Kant is here claiming that those people are totally wrong. And he spent some time telling us that, you know, all those proofs given by those subtle philosophical schools had no effect on the public at large. Nobody cared about that. So the fact that he has destroyed it, it doesn't matter, right? The only people who care are those stuck-up philosophers who now have to give up their metaphysical systems. That's okay. I mean, Kant isn't bothered by that. Like, the real practical effect of the critique can only be positive, he thinks. So that is basically what I want to say. There is one gigantic footnote near the end, in which Kant talks about the paralogisms, the principle of the pure understanding, and he sort of tries to explain how to understand him. And we can come to that footnote when we come to that part of the critique. It doesn't make much sense to read and try to understand it now. Alright, so that's that for the B preface, except for the fact that I want to say a lot more about what this Copernican revolution might be and what it could possibly mean that objects have to conform to our cognition rather than the other way around.